The sky above Velar Prime had turned black with enemy ships. Ambassador stood at the great window of the council chamber and watched the armada move into position. There were 12 warships, each one large enough to block out the sun. The people had never built weapons. They had never needed them. For 10,000 years, they had lived in peace on their crystal world, creating art and music and philosophy. Now that peace was ending. His body was made of living crystal like all. Light passed through the delicate structures of the ambassador's form and created rainbow patterns on the floor. It was beautiful. It was also terribly fragile. A single blow from a soldier would shatter into 1,000 pieces. There would be no fighting back. There would only be death. The council members gathered behind. There were 7 of them, the eldest and of their kind. Their crystalline bodies hummed with fear. The vibrations passed between them like whispered prayers. Council Elder spoke first. The elder's voice was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, asked what they should do. The Dominion had destroyed 14 civilizations in the past century. They harvested rare minerals from conquered worlds and left nothing but ash behind. Velar Prime was rich in quantum crystals, the rarest mineral in the galaxy. They would not leave until they had taken everything. Turned away from the window, the ambassador's form caught the dying light of the sunset and scattered it across the chamber walls. Said they must send a distress call. They must ask the galaxy for help. Elder made a sound like breaking glass. It was the expression of bitter laughter, reminded them that they had already contacted the Galactic Assembly. They had refused. Even the mighty Empire had refused. No one wanted war with the Dominion. They were not important enough to die for. Knew this was true. They had no military value. They had no strategic resources except the crystals that they wanted. They were artists and dreamers in a galaxy ruled by warriors and traitors. No one would risk their own people to save a species that could not even hold a weapon. But was not ready to give up. The ambassador walked to the communication console and began broadcasting on all frequencies. The message was simple. The people faced extinction. They begged anyone who could hear them to come to their aid. They had nothing to offer in return except gratitude. They could not fight. They could not pay. They could only hope that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, someone would care. The message went out across the galaxy. It traveled through relay stations and communication networks. It reached hundreds of worlds and thousands of species. And one by one, the responses came back. Silence, rejection, apology, regret. 3 days passed. The fleet moved closer. They were taking their time, enjoying the fear of their prey. Warlord, the commander of the armada, sent a message to the surface. He gave the 1 week to evacuate their cities. After that, the bombardment would begin. It was not mercy. It was efficiency. Dead bodies were harder to move than living refugees. Stop sleeping. The ambassador spent every hour at the communication console, listening for any response that might bring hope. The other council members had already begun making peace with their fate. Elder was composing a final symphony. Elder was recording the history of their people so that someone might remember them, but refused to accept the end. On the 5th day, a signal came through. It was weak and distant, originating from a part of the galaxy that they had never explored. The transmission was in a language that the translation systems did not recognize at first. It took several minutes to decode. The message was brief. A species called humans had received the distress call. They were sending a ship. Estimated arrival was 6 standard cycles. They asked her to hold on. Stared at the console. The ambassador had never heard of humans. A quick search of the galactic database revealed almost nothing. Humans were a young species from a small planet called Earth. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the past 2 centuries. They were not members of the Galactic Assembly. They had no known military power. They had no reputation at all. Elder approached and read the message. The Elder's crystalline form flickered with confusion. Asked why these humans would answer a call that everyone else had ignored. What did they want? What were they hoping to gain? Had no answer. It made no sense. A species with no power, no resources, and no connection to them was crossing the galaxy to help them. It could be a trick. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be nothing at all. But it was also hope, and hope was all they had left. Sent a response, thanking the humans for their offer and providing coordinates for safe approach. The ambassador did not know if one ship could make any difference against the armada. Logic said it could not. Logic said they were already dead and simply waiting for the end to arrive. But something in the human message stirred a feeling that had almost forgotten. The humans had not asked what they could offer. They had not calculated the risks or weighed the benefits. They had simply heard a cry for help and decided to answer it. In all of its long life, the ambassador had never encountered such a thing. The galaxy was a place of careful alliances and measured self-interest. Species helped each other when it served their purposes. No one sacrificed anything for strangers. Perhaps these humans were foolish. Perhaps they did not understand what they were flying into. Perhaps their ship would arrive just in time to be destroyed alongside the. But perhaps they were something else entirely, something the galaxy had never seen before. The ambassador looked up at the dark sky filled with enemy ships. 6 cycles. The humans would arrive in 6 cycles. The bombardment would begin in 2. Began composing a new message to the warlord. It was a request for negotiation, a plea for more time. It was probably useless, but they had survived for 10,000 years by finding ways to avoid conflict. Perhaps they could survive a little longer. Somewhere across the stars, a human ship was coming. Did not know what humans looked like or how they thought or what they could do. The ambassador knew only one thing. Someone had answered, someone was coming, and that changed everything. The human ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Velar system. It was smaller than the warships by a considerable margin. The vessel was called the Resolute, and it looked nothing like the elegant designs that most spacefaring species preferred. It was blocky and angular and covered in thick plates of metal. It looked like something built to survive rather than something built to impress. Ambassador watched the sensor readings from the council chamber. The fleet had paused their approach when the unknown vessel appeared. Warlord was curious. He sent a scanning beam toward the human ship and waited for the results. The readings made no sense to the technicians. The ship was incredibly dense. Its hull was made of layered steel and titanium alloys. Its engines burned chemical fuel at temperatures that would melt technology. Everything about it was heavy and crude and powerful. A communication came through from the Resolute. A human face appeared on the screen. It was the first time any had seen a human. Felt the council members recoil in shock. The human was terrifying. The creature had 2 small eyes set in a round head covered with strands of dead protein. Its skin was soft and pink and stretched over thick muscles. When it opened its mouth to speak, could see rows of white bone used for crushing food. The human was massive compared to a. Its body was built from dense tissue wrapped around a skeleton of calcium and mineral deposits. The human introduced herself as Commander Lisa Morgan of the Earth vessel Resolute. Her voice was deep and resonant. She said they had come as quickly as they could. She asked about the situation on the surface. Recovered enough to respond. The ambassador explained that the fleet would begin bombardment within 1 standard cycle. They had no weapons and no defenses. They had been trying to negotiate, but Warlord had no interest in talking. Commander Morgan nodded. Her face showed an expression that the translation systems identified as concern. She said her crew would beam down to the surface to assess the situation. She asked permission to land a shuttle. Granted it without hesitation. What choice was there? The humans were the only ones who had come. 1 hour later, a human shuttle touched down in the central plaza of the capital city. They gathered at a safe distance to watch. They had never seen aliens in person before. They had always communicated with other species through screens and holograms. The shuttle door opened, and 5 humans walked out. The crowd scattered in panic. Several of the younger ones cracked from the stress, their crystalline bodies developing fractures that would take weeks to heal. Even the council members stepped backward, their forms vibrating with instinctive fear. The humans were monsters. They walked on 2 thick legs that struck the ground with heavy impacts. Their arms swung at their sides, each one capable of crushing with a single motion. They breathed constantly, pulling in huge amounts of the toxic oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere that would kill most species in minutes. Their eyes scanned the crowd with a predator's awareness, tracking movement and assessing threats. Commander Morgan noticed the fear. She stopped walking and held up her hands in a gesture that meant peace among humans. She spoke slowly and softly. She said they meant no harm. She said they had come to help. Ambassador forced the fear down and approached the humans. Up close, they were even more terrifying. The commander stood nearly twice height. Her body radiated heat like a furnace. When she breathed out, the moisture in her breath crystallized in the cool air. Asked where the humans came from. What kind of world produced creatures like this? A younger human stepped forward. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Shaw. He explained that Earth was what scientists called it had high gravity that crushed weaker organisms. It had extreme temperature variations that ranged from frozen ice to boiling heat. It had a corrosive atmosphere, violent weather, tectonic instability, and millions of predator species competing for survival. Humans, Shaw explained, had evolved to survive all of it. They could heal from injuries that would kill other species. They could function for days without sleep. They could adapt to almost any environment. They could eat plants and animals and sometimes things that were not even food. Their bodies were designed by billions of years of deadly competition. Listened with growing horror. That was gentle and stable. The temperature never varied. The atmosphere was pure. There were no predators, no disasters, no violence of any kind. They had evolved to create beauty, not to survive destruction. Commander Morgan knelt down to bring herself closer to this level. Her movements were slow and careful, clearly meant to avoid startling the fragile ambassador. She said she understood they were afraid. Humans looked frightening to most species, but she promised that her crew would never harm them. She said humans had a strange quality. When they saw someone weaker being hurt by someone stronger, they felt compelled to intervene. It was not logical. It was not strategic. It was simply how humans were built. Asked why, what benefit did humans gain from protecting strangers? Morgan thought about the question. Then she said that humans did not always need a reason. Sometimes they helped because helping was the right thing to do. Sometimes that was enough. The ambassador looked at the other humans. A woman with dark hair was already examining the cracks in a young's crystal form, her face showing what the translator called compassion. A large man was scanning the buildings around the plaza, noting damage from the stress of the approaching invasion. Another human was setting up communication equipment, working to link the Resolute with the defense networks. They had been on the surface for less than an hour, and they were already working to help. Turned back to Commander Morgan. The ambassador said they had nothing to offer. They could not pay the humans. They could not fight alongside them. They could not even provide proper food or shelter for their physiology. Morgan smiled. It was an expression that showed teeth, which should have been threatening, but somehow it was not. She said they did not need to offer anything. She said humans did not help because they expected payment. They helped because someone needed them. And right now, they needed them very much. Felt something shift. The fear was still there, but alongside it something new was growing. It was fragile and uncertain, like a crystal forming for the first time. It was hope. The War Council took place in the underground chambers beneath the capital. The crystals that formed the walls glowed with soft light, creating an atmosphere of calm that felt absurd given the circumstances. Above them, the Armada was moving into final position. In less than 12 hours, the bombardment would begin. Ambassador sat at the head of the table with the other council members. Across from them sat Commander Morgan and her senior officers. The difference between the two groups was striking. They were translucent and delicate, their bodies humming with nervous energy. The humans were solid and dense, their faces set with expressions of grim determination. Lieutenant Shaw activated a holographic display showing the fleet formation. 12 warships arranged in a bombardment pattern. Each ship carried enough firepower to destroy a continent. The flagship was in the center, a massive vessel called the Claw of Dominion. That was where Warlord commanded his forces. Elder asked the obvious question. What could one small human ship do against such power? The mathematics were simple. The Resolute would be destroyed in seconds if it engaged the fleet directly. This was not courage. This was suicide. Commander Morgan acknowledged that was correct. The Resolute could not win a ship-to-ship battle, but humans had learned long ago that there were other ways to fight. Shaw changed the display to show the interior of the flagship. He explained that they were a hierarchical species. Their entire military structure depended on a single leader giving orders. Remove the leader, and the chain of command collapsed. Without Warlord, the fleet would not know what to do. Elder asked how the humans planned to remove the Warlord. The flagship was protected by thousands of soldiers. It had shields that could withstand nuclear weapons. It was the most heavily defended position in the entire Armada. Shaw smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. He said the humans intended to board the flagship and capture Warlord alive. The council chamber fell silent. They stared at the humans with a mixture of disbelief and horror. spoke slowly, making sure the translator was working correctly. The ambassador asked if the humans understood what they were proposing. Boarding actions were considered impossible by every spacefaring civilization. Ships fought at distances of thousands of kilometers. Soldiers did not cross between vessels. It was madness. Commander Morgan nodded. She said that most species thought that way. Most species preferred to fight from a safe distance, using machines and weapons to avoid personal risk. But humans were different. Dr. Lane, the ship's medical officer, explained the biology. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters on Earth. Their ancestors had chased prey across vast distances, running for hours or even days until the target collapsed from exhaustion. Humans were not the fastest or strongest predators on their world. They were the most stubborn. This stubbornness carried over into warfare. Humans fought in trenches and tunnels. They stormed beaches under heavy fire. They cleared buildings room by room. They did not retreat when they were hurt. They did not stop when they were afraid. Something in their psychology made them capable of pushing through pain and fear and exhaustion until the fight was over. Shaw added that humans also had a peculiar emotional response to witnessing harm against those they considered under their protection. When humans saw suffering, especially the suffering of those who could not defend themselves, they became aggressive. Their rational thinking decreased and their willingness to take risks increased. They were weak, they were suffering, and the human crew had spent the last several hours watching a gentle, peaceful species prepare for extinction. Dr. Lane said, quite calmly, that the crew of the Resolute was currently very angry. Process this information. The ambassador understood aggression as a concept but had never experienced it personally. Did not become angry. They did not have the biological capacity for it. The idea that the humans were willing to risk death because they were emotionally upset on behalf of strangers was difficult to comprehend. Commander Morgan laid out the plan. 23 human soldiers would use a small shuttle to approach the flagship during a moment of distraction. They would breach the hull and fight their way to the command deck. The goal was to capture Warlord and use him as a hostage to force the fleet to withdraw. The odds of success were low. The odds of survival were lower, but the humans were going to try anyway. Elder asked what would happen if the mission failed. What would happen to if the humans died in the attempt? Morgan was honest. She said they would be exactly where they were now, facing extinction with no hope of rescue, but the alternative was to do nothing and watch the bombardment happen. At least this way, there was a chance. Looked at the other council members. Their crystalline forms reflected the holographic light of the tactical display. None of them spoke. The ambassador turned back to Commander Morgan, said they could not help with the assault. They could not fight. They could not even provide tactical support. All they could offer was their gratitude. Morgan said that was enough. She stood and addressed her officers. She told them to prepare the boarding team. They would launch in 6 hours, timing the assault to coincide with the fleet's final approach. It would be dangerous. It would probably be deadly. But it was the only option they had. As the humans filed out of the chamber, Ambassador called out to the commander. The ambassador asked why humans did this. Why did they risk everything for species they had never met? What was wrong with them? Morgan paused at the doorway. She thought for a moment before answering. She said that maybe nothing was wrong with them. Maybe something was right. Then she walked out to prepare for war. They remained in the chamber, their crystal bodies humming with emotions they could not name. In a few hours, 23 humans would throw themselves into a battle that could not be won. They would do it for strangers. They would do it for people who could never repay them. Ambassador looked at the tactical display showing the massive fleet. Somewhere in the darkness, human soldiers were checking their weapons and saying goodbye to each other. It was the strangest thing the ambassador had ever witnessed. It was also, perhaps, the most beautiful. The shuttle launched from the Resolute in total silence. There were no communications, no engine flares, nothing that would alert the sensors. The 23 soldiers inside sat in darkness, breathing slowly, waiting for the moment of contact. Commander Lisa Morgan was not on the shuttle. Protocol required her to remain on the Resolute and coordinate from a distance. She hated it, but Sergeant Maria Flores was leading the assault team, and Morgan trusted her completely. Flores checked her weapon for the 10th time. Around her, the other soldiers did the same. They wore heavy combat armor designed for boarding actions. It was thick and reinforced, built to withstand the kind of close-quarters violence that would kill unprotected humans. Each soldier carried a rifle, a sidearm, and a combat knife. Some carried breaching charges. Others carried medical kits. Private Danny Vega sat next to Flores. He was young, barely 22 years old. His hands were shaking slightly. He had never been in real combat before. None of them had fought no human had. Flores put a hand on his shoulder. She told him to breathe. She told him to focus on the person next to him. She told him that fear was normal and that courage was not about being unafraid. Courage was about being terrified and doing the job anyway. Vega nodded. He steadied his breathing. The shaking stopped. The shuttle pilot, Lieutenant Amy Cole, announced they were approaching the flagship. The massive vessel filled the viewport, a mountain of metal and weapons floating in the darkness. Cole found a section of hull that was lightly defended and brought the shuttle in close. Corporal Nick activated the breaching charges. There was a flash of light and a section of the hull peeled away. Atmosphere rushed out into space. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut on the other side of the breach. The soldiers moved. They poured through the opening and into the corridors of the Claw of Dominion. The ship was designed for aliens with multiple limbs and low body weight. The ceilings were high, and the floors were covered in a sticky substance that helped the grip surfaces. For humans, it was awkward terrain. They did not care. The first soldiers appeared within seconds. They were tall creatures with exoskeletons of dark chitin and blade-like appendages. Their eyes were compound lenses that saw in multiple spectrums. They moved with the speed and precision of predators. Private Hayes fired the first shot. It struck a warrior in the chest and sent the creature sprawling backward. The sound of gunfire echoed through the metal corridors. The battle was brutal. They had numbers. They had knowledge of the ship layout. They had natural weapons built into their bodies. They swarmed the human boarding party from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm them with speed and aggression. But the humans did not break. Sergeant Flores led from the front, her rifle barking orders in the language of violence. She moved through like a force of nature, shooting, reloading, shooting again. When a blade caught her in the arm, she switched to her sidearm and kept fighting. Danny Vega took a blade through his shoulder. The pain was immense, like fire burning through his nerves. He screamed once. Then he gritted his teeth and raised his weapon with his other arm. He had a job to do. The pain could wait. Nick ran out of ammunition and grabbed a piece of metal debris from the floor. He used it as a club, smashing warriors aside with raw strength. When one of them knocked him down, he wrapped his arms around its neck and squeezed until something cracked. They had never seen anything like this. Their prey was supposed to run. Their prey was supposed to beg. These humans did neither. They pushed forward through injuries that should have been fatal. They fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. 2 hours after the breach, the human team reached the command deck. The doors were sealed. Private Amy Torres placed shaped charges on the hinges while the others provided cover fire. There was an explosion. The doors fell inward. Warlord the Unbroken stood in the center of the command bridge. He was enormous, even by standards. His exoskeleton was covered in scars from 100 battles. His blade arms were longer than a human was tall. Around him stood his personal guard, the elite warriors who had never lost a fight. Looked at the humans with compound eyes that showed no fear. He had heard of, he had never believed the stories. Now he saw the proof. These small, soft creatures had carved their way through his ship with nothing but primitive weapons and impossible determination. He raised his primary blade and issued a challenge. Single combat, one human against himself. If the human won, the fleet would withdraw. If won, the humans would surrender their ship. Sergeant Flores looked at her wounded soldiers. 7 of the original 23 were dead. Another 5 could barely stand. The rest were injured in some way. They had fought beyond the limits of what should be possible. Flores stepped forward. She was half the warlord's size. She had no natural armor, no blade arms, no venom glands. She had a knife, a handgun with 3 rounds remaining, and 10,000 years of human martial tradition encoded in her muscle memory. Attacked first, his blade swept through the air with killing speed. Flores was not there. She had already moved, sliding under the strike and coming up inside the warlord's guard. Her knife found a gap in his exoskeleton and twisted. Roared in pain and swung again. This time he caught her across the ribs. The impact sent her flying backward. She hit the wall hard enough to crack the metal. But she got up. The fight lasted 4 minutes, was faster and stronger. Flores was smaller and more desperate. She used every trick humans had ever learned about fighting larger opponents. She aimed for joints and soft tissue. She never stood still long enough to be hit cleanly. She absorbed damage that would have killed and kept moving. When it ended, was on his knees with a broken arm and Flores's knife, pressed against the soft tissue of his throat. The warlord's personal guard stood frozen. Their commander was defeated. Their honor demanded they rescue him, but the human had made her position clear. Any movement and their leader died. Flores looked at the warriors with blood running down her face. She was barely standing. Her ribs were broken. Her vision was blurring. But she smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had caught her prey. She told them to order the fleet to withdraw. She told them the bombardment of Velar Prime was over. She told them that if they ever threatened the again, more humans would come. Millions of them. Warlord gave the order. His voice was filled with something they had not felt in generations. Fear. The fleet slowly. 12 warships turned away from Velar Prime and moved toward the edge of the system. They did not fire a single shot. They did not issue any threats. They simply left, taking their wounded pride with them. Ambassador watched the sensor readings from the council chamber. The crystalline forms of the other council members glowed with colors that had no names. Relief, perhaps, or wonder, or something entirely new that they had never needed to feel before. On the surface of the planet, the human shuttle touched down in the central plaza. The hatch opened, and the survivors emerged. There were fewer of them now. 23 had gone up. 16 came back. The rest would never return to Earth. They had given everything for a species they had never met. Sergeant Maria Flores walked at the front of the group. Her arm was in a sling, and her face was covered in bandages. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had pushed their body far beyond its limits, but she was smiling. They gathered to watch. They kept their distance at first, still uncertain about these strange creatures who had saved them. But one by one, they moved closer. A young with cracks still healing in their crystal form approached Flores and made a sound like gentle chimes. The translator rendered it as thank you. Flores looked down at the fragile being. She could have crushed it with a careless movement. Instead, she knelt down slowly and extended her uninjured hand, palm up. She said they were welcome. Commander Lisa Morgan arrived on the next shuttle. She walked through the plaza, surveying the damage and taking reports from her officers. The Resolute was still in orbit, keeping watch until the fleet was completely gone. The threat was over, but Morgan did not believe in taking chances. Ambassador approached the commander. The ambassador's crystalline body cast rainbow patterns in the light of the setting sun. His voice was soft, like distant music. The ambassador asked if Morgan would explain something. They had lived for 10,000 years and they had never encountered a species like humans. They created art. They composed symphonies. They debated philosophy, but they had never learned to fight. They had never needed to. Morgan said she understood. Not every species evolved under the same pressures. The world was gentle. It had created a gentle people. There was nothing wrong with that. Said they had always believed that violence was a failure of intelligence. If beings were wise enough, they would find peaceful solutions to every conflict. War was for primitives who lacked the capacity for reason. Morgan was quiet for a moment. Then she said that humans had believed something similar once. They had hoped that as they became more advanced, war would disappear. They had been wrong. She said that some beings did not want peace. Some beings wanted to take and destroy and dominate. Against such beings, reason was not enough. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to stand between them and those who would harm them. That was what humans did, not because they loved violence, but because someone had to do it. Considered this, the ambassador's form hummed with thought, then asked another question. Why had the humans come? What did they gain from crossing the galaxy to save strangers? Morgan took a deep breath. She looked up at the sky where the fleet had been. She looked at the wounded soldiers being treated by Dr. Lane. She looked at the young who were beginning to emerge from their shelters, their crystalline bodies catching the light. She said humans had a concept called duty. It was the idea that strength created obligation. Those who could help were required to help, not for reward, not for recognition, but because failing to act when you could have acted was a kind of betrayal. They had called for help, the humans had heard, and so the humans had come. It was as simple as that. Ambassador was silent for a long time. The other council members had gathered behind the ambassador, listening to every word. They were trying to understand these impossible creatures who had appeared from nowhere and saved their world. Elder spoke. The elder's voice was like crystal bells in a morning breeze, asked how they could repay this debt. They had nothing to offer, no weapons, no resources, no strength. Commander Morgan shook her head. She said they did not owe humans anything. This was not a transaction. This was not a trade. The humans had done what was right, and that was its own reward. But then she paused. She said there was one thing they could do. Someday, somewhere in the galaxy, there would be another species in trouble. Another people facing extinction at the hands of someone stronger. When that day came, Morgan asked that they remember what had happened here. She asked them to help. Not with weapons, not with violence. There were artists and dreamers, and the galaxy needed artists and dreamers, but there were other ways to help. They could offer shelter. They could share knowledge. They could simply be present so that those who were suffering knew they were not alone. That was how debts like this were repaid. Not to the ones who had given, but to the ones who would need giving in the future. Ambassador listened. The other council members listened, and something changed in the way they saw the universe. 3 days later, the Resolute departed. The human ship climbed into orbit and then accelerated toward the edge of the system. Commander Morgan sent a final message to the surface, wishing the peace and prosperity. Ambassador watched the ship disappear into the darkness between stars. The ambassador would never forget these humans. None of them would. In the galactic records, a new entry was created. It described a species called humans from a small planet called Earth. The entry noted that they were evolved on a world of crushing gravity and constant danger. It noted that they were physically powerful and psychologically resilient. But someone had added a note at the bottom of the entry. It was unofficial. It was not part of the standard classification system, but it was important. The note said that humans answered distress calls. It said that they fought for strangers. It said that they did not abandon those who could not defend themselves. The note ended with a simple recommendation. When encountering humans, approach with caution, or approach with hope. Ambassador looked up at the empty sky and made a decision. They had always been peaceful. They would remain peaceful, but they would also remember what the humans had taught them. Sometimes the greatest strength was not the ability to fight. Sometimes it was the willingness to help. And someday, when someone else needed them, they would be there. They would pay the debt forward. They would make the humans proud. The sun set over Velar Prime. The crystal cities began to glow with their own inner light. And somewhere in the darkness of space, a ship full of strange and wonderful creatures was already looking for the next world that needed them. The galaxy would never be quite the same again.